Welcome back to the Climate Layer. I'm Alex Bonat. We've spent the last few episodes talking about what's broken. 7 of 9 planetary boundaries crossed, the ocean under pressure from every direction, the technologies that are scaling despite political headwinds, the ways we're falling behind. And I know that can feel heavy. It is heavy, because the stakes are real. But today I want to do something different. I want to talk about what is working. Not those pilot projects, not experiments, not someday solutions, real countries, real policies, real results at scale. So I want to start with a moment from 2013. I just finished school and was driving cross-country to California, East Coast to West Coast. I saw incredible things along the way. Natural parks with views that take your breath away. Vast farms that seem to never end, producing food as far as I could see. But here's where I have to admit I'm a complete nerd. Because when I hit the wind turbines in Colorado, I was fascinated. I couldn't stop looking at them. They were beautiful, peaceful, these massive structures turning slowly against the mountains, generating electricity in a way that produces no smoke, no emissions, no extraction. Just wind moving through blades, turning kinetic energy into power. And what struck me was this. The landscape wasn't diminished by them. If anything, to me, it was made more beautiful. Because here was energy generation that wasn't looking to take from the land. It wasn't drilling. It wasn't mining. It wasn't burning. It was just there, working with the wind, protecting the landscape while providing power. That moment stuck with me. That is what renewable energy looks like at scale. And it's not just beautiful as an idea, it works, we have proof. So if you're tired of doom and gloom, this episode is for you. Let's talk about places that got it right and what we can learn from them. Let me start with Denmark, because Denmark's wind story is not just impressive, it's instructive. Denmark now generates over 50% of its electricity from wind. In some years, they have hit 70%. That's not a typo. 70% of a developed country's electricity from wind turbines. So how do they do it? First, they started early. Denmark began investing in wind power in the 1970s during the oil crisis. When other countries saw high oil prices as a temporary problem, Denmark saw it as a reason to build energy independence. Second, they were consistent. Governments changed, parties shifted, but the commitment to wind power remained. Decades of policy stability allowed the industry to plan, invest, and scale. Third, they made it economically smart. Denmark incentivized wind development through feed-in tariffs. It guaranteed prices for wind electricity that made projects financially viable. They built the transmission infrastructure to move power from where wind farms were located to where people needed electricity. They invested in grid flexibility to handle variable wind generation. Fourth, and this is crucial, they brought the public along. Denmark has a tradition of community-owned wind turbines. Local residents could invest in wind projects and share in the profits. That meant wind power wasn't something imposed on communities, it was something communities benefited from directly. The result? Denmark is now a global leader in wind technology. Danish companies like Vestas and Ørsted export wind turbines and offshore wind expertise around the world. What started as an energy security strategy became an economic engine. So what's the lesson here? Long-term policy consistency matters more than perfection. Denmark didn't wait for the technology to be perfect. They invested when wind turbines were expensive and inefficient. And as they built more, costs came down, technology improved, and wind became the cheapest source of new electricity. Political commitments across administrations matters. If every election creates policy whiplash, industries cannot plan long-term investments. Denmark proved that stability unlocks scale. And public buy-in matters. When communities see economic benefits, not just costs, renewable energy stops being a culture war issue and becomes a local economic opportunity. Denmark showed that a small country with no fossil fuel resources could become an energy exporter by investing in wind. And they did it over decades, not overnight. So let's talk about Norway and electric vehicles, because what Norway has accomplished is frankly astonishing. Over 90% of new cars sold in Norway are electric. 90%. In 2025, plug-in electric vehicles accounted for over 90% of new car sales. Gas cars are basically extinct in the new car market there. How did this happen? Norway didn't lecture people about climate change. They made EVs the economically rational choice through smart policy. First, they eliminated taxes on EVs. Norway has very high taxes on new cars, except electric vehicles. That meant EVs were often cheaper up front than equivalent gas cars, even before accounting for fuel savings. Second, they made EVs convenient. Free parking in city centers, access to bus lanes, no tolls on highways, free charging at public stations in many cities. If you drove an EV in Norway, your daily life got easier and cheaper. Third, they built the charging infrastructure early. Norway invested heavily in public charging stations before most people owned EVs. That eliminated range anxiety. If you knew you could charge anywhere, buying an EV became less risky. Fourth, they didn't ban gas cars. They just made EVs so much more attractive that the market shifted naturally. People chose EVs because it made economic sense, not because they were forced to. The result? Norway went from a tiny EV market share to global leadership in just over a decade. And this is a country with cold winters, long distances, and rural populations. All the conditions people claim make EVs impractical. What's the lesson? Incentives work. If you make clean technology cheaper and more convenient than the alternative, people will choose it. You don't need mandates. You need smart economics. Infrastructure investment matters. Norway didn't wait for EV adoption to build charging stations. They built the infrastructure first, which enabled adoption. And gradual transition works better in sudden disruption. Norway gave people a decade to adjust. Early adopters got the biggest benefits. Over time, as EVs became mainstream, some incentives were scaled back, but by then the market had shifted. Norway proved that rapid EV adoption is possible even in challenging climates, and they did it by making the economics work for consumers. Now let's talk about Iceland, because Iceland's energy story is one of the most remarkable transformations on the planet. Nearly 90% of homes in Iceland are heated with geothermal energy. Roughly 75% of the country's electricity comes from renewable sources, mostly geothermal and hydropower. Iceland went from importing fossil fuels to producing nearly all of its energy domestically from renewable sources. How do they do it? Iceland sits on top of volcanic activity, which means they have abundant geothermal resources. Hot water and steam are accessible relatively close to the surface, but having the resource is not the same as using it. Iceland started investing in geothermal infrastructure in the 1970s, around the same time Denmark committed to wind. They built district heating systems, networks of pipes carrying hot water from geothermal plants to homes and businesses across entire cities. Reykjavik, the capital, is almost entirely heated this way. They made long-term infrastructure investments that took decades to pay off, drilling geothermal wells, building pipelines, connecting buildings, maintaining systems. It wasn't cheap up front, but once built, the fuel was essentially free, and the systems lasted for decades. And they used geothermal not just for heating, but for electricity generation. Geothermal power plants provide baseload electricity. They run continuously, unlike solar and wind, which are intermittent. That makes geothermal incredibly valuable for grid stability. The result? Iceland has some of the cheapest electricity in the world. Industries like aluminum smelting, which require massive amounts of energy, set up operations in Iceland because power is abundant and cheap. Energy went from a cost burden to an economic advantage. Now here is why this matters beyond Iceland. For a long time, geothermal was limited to places with obvious volcanic activity. But new drilling technologies, including plasma drilling, are changing that equation. Plasma drilling can reach much deeper into the Earth's crust, accessing heat that was previously uneconomical to tap. That means geothermal could become viable in far more places, not just volcanic regions. The United States has massive geothermal potential, the western states especially. With new drilling technologies, geothermal could provide significant baseload renewable power, filling the gap that solar and wind leave when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So what's the lesson from Iceland? Baseload renewable energy is possible. Geothermal provides the reliability that fossil fuel plants offer, but without emissions. And it's not theoretical. Iceland's been doing it for decades. Long-term infrastructure investments pay off. Iceland committed to geothermal when it was expensive and uncertain, but they kept building, and now they have energy independence and an economic advantage. And technology innovation unlocks new possibilities. Plasma drilling is making geothermal viable in places it never was before. That's the kind of innovation that changes the game. Iceland showed that a small country with the right resources and the right investments could transform its energy systems completely. And new technology is making their success replicable in far more places. So what about the United States? Because it's easy to look at federal policy and feel discouraged. But if you zoom in, there are real bright spots. Texas leads the United States in wind power generation. Yeah, Texas. The state produces more wind energy than any other, over 37 gigawatts of installed capacity. And it's not because of climate activism. It's because Texas has great wind resources and landowners make money leasing land to wind developers. Economics drove deployment. California has paired solar with battery storage at massive scale. As solar costs dropped and battery costs plummeted, California utilities started building solar plus storage projects instead of natural gas peaker plants. The economics worked. And now, California regularly hits days where renewables provide over 90% of electricity. The northeast of the U.S. is building an offshore wind pipeline despite federal hostility. Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island all have legally binding commitments to offshore wind. Vineyard Wind is operational. More projects are coming online because states made long-term commitments that developers could rely on. These aren't federal climate policies, they're state-level decisions driven by economics, energy security, and local priorities, and they're working. So what's the lesson there? Even in a fragmented political environment, progress is possible. When the federal government won't lead, states can. Regional coalitions can coordinate, and the economics of clean energy are compelling enough that deployment happens even without national mandates. The U.S. has the resources, the technology, and the economic incentives to deploy renewables at scale. What we lack is political consistency at the federal level, but states are proving that you don't need federal leadership to make progress. So what do Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and the U.S. bright spots have in common? First, long-term policy commitment. Denmark committed to wind in the 1970s and stuck with it. Norway built EV incentives gradually over a decade. Iceland invested in geothermal infrastructure across multiple decades. Texas didn't flip-flop on wind. They let the market work. Consistency allowed industries to plan, invest, and scale. Second, economic alignment. Denmark made wind profitable through feed-in tariffs. Norway made EVs cheaper than gas cars through tax policy. Iceland made geothermal economically smart through infrastructure investment. Texas landowners make money from wind leases. When clean energy is the economically rational choice, deployment accelerates. Third, infrastructure investment. Denmark built transmission for wind. Norway built charging infrastructure before mass EV adoption. Iceland built district heating systems. California built grid-scale battery storage. You can't deploy new technology without infrastructure to support it. Fourth, public engagement and buy-in. Denmark had community-owned wind. Norway made EVs convenient for daily life. Iceland provided cheap heating to nearly every home. When people see direct benefits, opposition decreases. And fifth, willingness to start before technology is perfect. Denmark invested in wind when turbines were expensive and inefficient. Norway built charging infrastructure before most people owned EVs. Iceland drilled geothermal wells when costs were high. Waiting for perfection means never starting. These countries started early and improved as they went. And now, innovation is accelerating what is possible. Plasma drilling is making geothermal viable beyond volcanic regions. Battery storage costs are plummeting, making solar and wind more reliable. Offshore wind technology is improving, lowering costs and increasing capacity factors. The tools exist, the economics work, the examples are real. Denmark gets over 50% of its electricity from wind. Norway sells almost exclusively electric vehicles. Iceland heats nearly every home with geothermal energy. Texas generates more wind power than most countries. California pairs solar with storage at massive scale. These are not theoretical futures. They're happening right now. The solutions are real, the technology works. The economics increasingly favor clean energy. And we have proof from multiple countries with different political systems and different resources that rapid energy transitions are possible when policy and economics align. So what's stopping us? Not technology, not economics, not resources. Again, I've said it before, political will, consistency, the courage to make long-term investments even when the payoff is a decade away. Denmark made that choice in the 1970s. Norway made it in the 2000s. Iceland made it decades ago. And now they're reaping the benefits. Energy independence, economic advantages, and drastically lower emissions. The question isn't, can we do this? We know we can. The question is, will we? Next time, we're going to talk about water, the planetary boundary we crossed that no one's talking about, where your water actually goes, why geography matters, and what responsible water use looks like when you understand your context. It's one of those topics that feels simple until you dig in, and then you realize how much we take for granted every time we turn on a tap. Until then, remember what is possible. Remember what Denmark, Norway, and Iceland have proven. And remember that we have everything we need to build the future, except the political will to commit. Thanks for listening. I'm Alex Bernat, and this is The Climate Layer.